Good morning. We're working on osserver.net. We're going to be doing the refactoring today and getting this ready to push out onto NuGet. So the first thing that I want to look at here is in my application itself. We need to make a new project. And we're going to make this a class library.net standard. And I want to put this in a new project called jwt.net. And all I'm going to do for jwt.net is I'm going to bring across the service that I wrote called the JWT service. Now, when I look at this, it wants to have my client in here. Let's go ahead and see what we can do here. So we're going to add in our tokens. So if I was to look at this thing, this currently has, let's make a new type of model in here, call a new folder called models. And in here, we want to bring across my token response. And we're going to put this in jwt.net .models. We don't need this. And we don't need this one. Now my user manager, so you're using this data access layer quite a few places. We also want to bring across the request token. So it looks like that these things are tightly coupled. Hey, Thriven. How are you doing, man? It's been a while. You've been building your own NuGet package? Yeah, I've got quite a few of them. If you come up here to NuGet.pixelhorrorstudios.com, you can see I've got 38 packages currently with 147,000 downloads. PHS Core alone has 11,500, which is cool. So we're getting ready to push this project, osserver.net, onto NuGet, and then we're also going to create a Docker image so that you can spin it up without ever having to go into the code. So when I'm looking at this, client looks like it should be here. These entities. Which means that this service doesn't really make too much sense. So if I was to remove the client from this, and we add in the response here, and then I want to look up NuGet package for this, system identity models JWT. .NET Framework Standard. So into this, I want to add in a client ID. And I also want to pass in the client secret. I don't know what this is upset about. We have the user manager in here because got that one, client ID. This one is the client secret. See, on this, you really want to have these clients. So let me go back here. And we're going to add back in the client here, like that. And then in my entities, I'm going to make a new folder in here. Whoops, what just happened? Okay, we're going to make a new entity called client. And we're going to bring in auth code client credentials implicit redirect UR and the RO password. Now, instead of doing that, we're actually going to make its own client like this. And we're going to make a new class called iClient, which will be a public interface. And on this, we want to say that it has a client ID, client secret, token expiration, issuer, audience, and validate, and all this stuff. And then in JWT service now, you can say that this is models and this is an iClient. And then we want to make a new refresh token. Which is happening here. And we're actually creating an instance of it. And in this one, we just want to have the token, the scopes, when it expires, if it is expired, when it's been created, and all that stuff. So up here, I'm going to make a new JWT service for the app, right? And we want to inherit from JWT service. And this method public override generate authorization code. No, generate refresh token. That's a protected override generate refresh token. Now this one wants to be a iRefresh token. Like that. Like that. And then here we can return the data access layer for adding it. And my iRefresh token, we want to add in the models. And this one is going to be entities. And then that's all we're going to return. So in this one, we want to add in the constructor here. The data access layer. Like that. And then like that. Hey Keith, where are you storing the refresh tokens? I'm storing the refresh tokens in my SQL server. This is using Entity Framework. And then there's a token, and then there's a service that goes through and cleans them up. Are you talking about on the client side? So here, this user manager, if I was to remove this, so with JWTNet, you do want to couple this with you do want to couple this with a database, right? Because it needs to have this application user. So let's do that. So instead of doing this, I'm going to create a new folder in here called entities. And we're going to bring in my client, my project, not the project. The refresh token, the authorization code. And then I want to make a data folder. And I want to bring in an application database context. Let's start with that. So we need to put this in the right namespace, jwt.net. Use Mongo, there's an index that auto-delete things after whenever the time limit on the index is. I could switch that to Mongo easily. I'm just using SQL Server because I'm using the identity system to manage everything. So this wants me to add in Microsoft Identity Framework Core. So this one, let's add it in. .NET Standard. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Entity worked with any database. I thought it was SQL Server exclusive. I guess you could do it with any ODBC connection, right? Huh. Didn't look like it added it. This is .NET Standard 2.1. So can I upgrade this to be 2.1? SQLite, baby, says Thriven. I use SQLite a little bit, just on small things, but I mean, there's no backup on that data, you know what I mean? It's on the client device. My APIs use the Mongo driver, which gives me all that glorious link stuff. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too, man. Interesting. I have to think about that. Let's update this to the new one. We also need in here a application user. And we're going to change these all to be jwt.net.models.entities. And we'll also bring down base entity. So we don't have project anymore. And we don't have these resource servers anymore. And on the context, and let's go ahead and unload the other projects now. We're going to kill that one and this resource server. So if any framework works with any database, technically your NuGet package could be database agnostic, right? Asked Thurvin. Yep, that's what I'm thinking as well. So I could decouple them. The only thing is that the ASP.NET identity system, I'm using that, but it could work with any database, so it could be totally decoupled. Entity is the old mindset. It means identity servers, JWTs, unless they have to added something new to identity. So JWTs are just for authentication, but the OAuth stuff, the identity servers, that's all for authorization. So that's done. This iClient now, we can get rid of it. And this refresh token, the same thing. But we want to keep token response. And that looks good. And now in our service, we want these to be clients. We don't need this constructor. Here, we're going to pass in a client. Let's go back and do it the other way, because I want these to pass in just a client ID. And then I want them to retrieve the client. We need to have a data access layer in here, so we're going to add a new services class. And in this, I want to add the data access layer. And we're going to call this jwt.net.services. And we'll inject the database context here. We don't need all of these methods now. Yeah, scrap those. And then in this, we want to inject my new data access layer. I use the roles part of the JWT for authorization. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So you can do the roles, right? And you can have it so you don't necessarily have to have like the user endpoint, the user info endpoint and claims. And that works really well when you just have like a authorization authentication situation without a third-party API. Once you have a third-party API and you want to give like consumers a way to access it, like for example, Alley Chat, which has an API which you can use an implicit client with to log in and get a token to hit it. That's where it gets, I guess you could still do that kind of with JWTs. So, that try with an empty cache is spicy. I don't know where you're looking at for that one. Probably because I'm just wrapping it to get everything. My brain is fried. Kids kept me up all night. You going to be a Robin a few months from now? You are. I can't think. Robin's going to be me. I have several. Yep. It's only like a month away, guys. It's like around the corner. It could happen any day, realistically now. Just terrifying. Okay. Okay. And the only one that we don't have figured out here is the user manager. This one we can do a task.fromResult of this. And in my overload, we're going to add this whole thing back. And now let's add the user manager. of the application user. Like that. And I think that this service is now complete. So we're going to extract an interface from it. Yeah, exactly. The client secret stuff gives a third-party access to the users in the system. Exactly. Take a look at oauth0.net. I believe I've been looking at that for explanations of different things. I feel like they've had a lot of articles that I've read regarding simplifying the OAuth process. When I look at this now, we got decode token, exchange authorization, generate authorization code, exchange authorization code, generate token, decode token, revoke token, and validate token. And that's it. So now up here, I can scrap my JWT service. And in my startup, I want to register the one from the jwt.net. This needs to go in the data folder. Now when I look at my entities here, application user is going to extend jwt.net.models.entities.application user. Like that. Okay, hold on. You need to extend client to include project. You need to extend application user to include projects. In your database context, down here under entities, we can get rid of auth code, client credentials, implicit RO password, and move those up here into entities. And then I can change this client to be not abstract. Which means that these need to go into the proper namespace now. Like that. They have a free setup. You can see how to implement everything. It's easy. That's what I'm trying to do with this one. So this one, it's just going to be a Docker image. You're just going to open the port, and then I'll have a UI. You can just customize your clients, and you're done. That's the goal by the end of it. In client core's origin, these all come from the... Well, you can extend that, right? We don't want to extend it because we have different entities. So like that. And these ones are the same. This client, we want it to be models.entities.client. And this one, we want it to be models.entities.applicationuser. We can get rid of base entity. And resource server has a client. So we need to add in here a collection of resource server. Which looks right. Let's go ahead and rebuild it now. Okay, client implicit can't be found in the JWT service. So down here under client, we're going to add in a new class called enums. And I'm going to have a new type here called public enum client type. And we have authorization code, implicit, RO password, and client credentials. Now, I don't love this because the idea was that it was going to be extendable. So I'll just scrap this little bit and then I can get rid of this enums. My data access layer doesn't know that it's this one. So in my services here, I need to register a second database context for the jwt.net.data.application database context. So JWT service knows what to use. That's a dead term if I've ever heard one. Data access layer? Why do you say that? If you interface it, then that's how I can keep it decoupled from the database itself. You have a user service. So in here, I'm going to change this to be a user service. And we'll do this as an interface. And that's all it's going to be. So this inherits from iUserService. Now, application user is different. So you want to say T, where T is a type of application user. And we want to say this is of application user. Entity is your data access layer. Building a new data access layer on top of the one is a duplicate work. Yep, so the reason I do that is because this data access layer, I'm interfacing this, I'm removing the class, and then jwt.net will not have a dependency on any database. So up here we want to say iUserService. And that needs to be of type application user. We want to say that this is jwt.net.services.iUserService. Which needs to be of type application user. Okay. And so now we change this to be the iUserService and change this to be iData access layer. Now I can strip everything. Goes pretty quick, just another second. Okay, we can delete this bit. I don't build NuGets for people waste of time. I just build functional software, and those libs are insanely easy. Yeah, that's why this thing's going to end up as a Docker image. That way, you don't have to go into the code. You can just launch it. Okay, I should have just extracted the interface, but it would have been out of order, so at least this keeps my OCD in check. Almost done. Last one. Add the suffixes. Get rid of the public virtual asyncs. And we're done. So over here in the startup, I need to say jwt.net.services.idataAccessLayer, data access layer. And this one needs to inherit from jwt.net.services.idataAccessLayer. Now, we have to go back in here. I need to change this to be a T, where T is a type of application user. Nope. No, I don't. There's no application users in here. Perfect. Now, what it does not like is that my clients are different. So these need to be from the right entity. Now I have a... So let's get rid of that. And let's just fully qualify these. And up here we want to say T, where T is a type of client. Okay, so now here, I can change this to be a client, and that's going to be ambiguous, and we want to do it for the models.entities.client. There it is. And this wants to be of a type client, like that. Okay, so we've got our application database context, which we don't need here anymore. We've got our entities. We've got the response. We've got our two services. And now for my dependencies, I can get rid of identity framework. And do we need to keep JWTs? I believe so. So here, I want to use the iUser service. And we want this to be of a type T, where T is a client. And then we also want to say A, where A is a type of application user. Okay, so down here now, where we're doing this, I should have a GUID for the ID. It's not a GUID, it's a string. Now I need to change this application user because it's not part of the identity user system now. Okay, so that means that I want to add on here a ID, and we're going to say prop ID called ID. I want this to be inheriting from the base entity. We want to add in the annotations. And we want this to be of a type ID here. We can get rid of this active flag. Which means that this user service has an ID. Our application user is a base entity of type ID. Okay, that's not correct here. So it's not of a type base entity, but instead we're going to extract an interface from this, like that. Which means in the iUser service, A is a type of iApplication user. And my client here is of type ID. Just a few more. And the refresh token here needs to be of type ID. Okay. So we're going to unload this project. We'll take a look at this again. That looks right. This needs to be of type ID. And this is because some people don't want to use GUIDs. You could use integers. You could use longs. You could use a string. I don't care. That's the point. Now, I'm really thinking that these entities all should just be interfaces, right? Let me see. So up here, we'll add in the ID. And this is the ID for the app user. This needs to be of the ID, and then this is a I application user of ID, and the authorization code is a I authorization code. Token response is good. Let's go ahead and extract this interface. Authorization code, we want to extract that interface. Like that. Now there's no more interface, or there's no more, if I look in the JWT service, see like refresh token, you're making that, and you also have a data access layer where we're passing in types. Which means this one is an I authorization code, and then we want to do this by ID. This one we want to do also as a I refresh token. Like that, of ID. See, these are never actually called. This is an iRefresh token now. Up here, this is of ID, 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 and ID. JWT service needs to have the ID. Like that. Hold on. Where app user, there we go. Okay. Generate token here. This needs to be of type ID. And this refresh token, this needs to be of type ID. Same thing with this one. So I want to have a new function for this in one of the services that handles this. We want this to be an iToken response. We do need this refresh token, like this. But I can scrap some fields on it. We don't need the when I look back over here at where this is being generated, you are creating the actual one. So we can get rid of the replaced by token, client, all of that. Okay. That's good. This needs to be of type ID and then ID. Okay, authorization code, we don't care about this. And this needs to be app user ID. So we can get rid of this one, and then we can extract the interface like that. If I look at this again, do I still have these entities or did I delete them? So like application user, I can bring him up here. And this is a a string. And then I want to make this a identity user, like that. And then when I look at my application user again, this is a app user ID and then an ID. Like that. So now we can scrap it from here. Authorization code. We can bring it up. This is inheriting from base entity and I authorization code. Which needs to be for app user ID and then ID. And in this one, we don't need client. But we do in all the other stuff. And this is a GUID, like that. Looks good. So now I can scrap this one. Right? Before I do it. We want to have the ID app user. Like that. And then that. Like that. And then this is ID app user here. It's I application user, which needs to have a type of app user ID and ID. So like that. This one needs to return the IApp authorization code. Of the app user ID. And now this one needs to have the ID of the app user. Down here, get application user. This is ID of the app user. This is in client. So if I was to extract the interface from this, I don't care about these collections. So this base entity needs to have an interface. Like that. Get rid of this one. We don't need this one or this one. Okay, we got this redirect URI, which I can say is a iBase entity of the ID. And then this is an ID for the client ID in the redirect URI. Client cores origin. Same thing. And then this is a iBase entity of type ID. And now we can change this to be called interfaces. When we look at these services, we now can get rid of this ID here. In that one. Data access layer, I think I can get rid of the, this is a, you just want to say it's an iClient of ID. It doesn't matter anything else. We don't need this as a T. We do need this app user ID. Like that. So now when I'm looking at this, this is the app user ID. This is a no T anymore. Like that. Hey Matthew Eskelin, do you use unit tests to test the IDAL? I'm trying to decide how much to focus in on testing my apps. For many of my applications, I do. I don't have any unit tests in with this one yet, but I probably will add them. But yeah, that's one of the really nice things about the interface is that it makes unit testing really easy. If you haven't done a lot of unit tests, it's worth the time to do it for one of the project, but you'll realize it's kind of like a time sink. It's really helpful for certain ORMs, like if you're using like Dapper. I found that like changes to the models don't immediately get reflected in the database and can cause problems. But with Entity, it seems like I can get away without. This data access layer no longer has a T. And this one is just a app user and an ID for the app user. Okay, over here, we need to include the app user ID. Okay, it says my exchange authorization code here needs to be a app user ID. Actually, this is just returning a string. And for this one, when we create the authorization code, I want to add in here, instead of passing that one type, I'm going to pass in this here is a app user ID. And this is an ID. This get client needs to be for a ID. So I have to change this. So that we're not passing GUIDs, we're only passing IDs. Okay. So in this create authorization code, we actually want to pass in a app user ID for the application user ID, a ID for the client ID, the string for the redirect URI, a string for the scopes, an int for the lifespan minimum, a string for the created by IP. So here now we can do var authorization code equals await data access layer dot create authorization code asynchronous, and we can just pass in the application user ID, client ID, redirect URI. The scopes, lifespan min, and created by IP. Like that. So this is a app user ID. This is a string. So generate authorization code here. This needs to be a string app user ID. Says exchange authorization code does not have the right return type. It doesn't. And the last one is generate token async. This needs to be app user ID. Okay. This needs to be app user ID. We'll fix this. So in my add refresh token, we're going to change this to be a app user ID, application user ID, an ID for the client ID, a string for the scopes, an int for the expiration time in days, and a string for the IP address. And so we can say token equals await data access layer dot add refresh token, and it's going to be a application user ID, client ID, scopes, expiration time in days, IP address. And this is wrong, because you want this to include the token, a date time for the expires, a date time for the created, date time.utcnow.add days, expiration time in days, date time.utcnow. There we go. So now I can delete these two, refresh and token response. And now everything is done through interfaces in this service. Where is app user being used? In your user service. So your JWT implementation is using this user service and this data access layer. Okay. Like that. Our user service, we can do it the other way. Like that. Okay, let's rebuild this now and see what happens. Okay, here, my application user is only going to be a string. This one is under .NET models. This isn't what we want. We want to look at this one. Let me reload the project. Let's rebuild it. My errors are not propagating. Here we go. I see one here. Token response. So this is saying that I need to have the response here. But instead, I'm going to do this in the data access layer. I'm going to add a new function called task of an iToken response. And I'm going to call this get token asynchronous. And I want to pass in here the string for the access token, the string for the refresh token, a string for the token type, and a date time for the expires n. I'm sorry, that's an int. And this is going to be data access layer dot get token asynchronous of this access token, this refresh token, this token type, and this expires n. Let's rebuild it. It works. All right. So this is our completely dependency-less JWT.NET library. So now we're going to go back into authserver.net. And I want to look at the entities, because I feel like I hacked some out. So let's go through these entities and redo them. Your user service, let's start here. iApplicationUser needs to be from there, and then iApplicationUser of the string. Authorization code is iAuthorizationCode code of the string and then a GUID. Base entity is iBase entity of a GUID. Client is iClient of a GUID. This is iClient Core's origin of a GUID. This is a iClient redirect URI of a GUID. This is a iClient scope of a ID, which is a good. Project is fine. Refresh token is iRefresh token of a good. Just 1 second, guys. All right, I'm back with you. Sorry about that. Just a quick phone call. All right, let's go back here and get this back going. So this iRefresh token also needs to have the app user, right? And it says that it doesn't have replaced by token. So can I make this a nullable? The ID must be a non-nullable type in order to use it in the method nullable t. This is so annoying. So I want to say that it could be nullable, so it needs to be a primitive. So if I was to do it in the database context here, I could do like a model builder.entity of the refresh token has foreign key. It's going to be has one replaced by token with one because I want to set which one's optional. So let's say generic C# nullable constraint. So we could do like an ID nullable and then do a GUID like that. Which means up here we need to say ID nullable. So this is app user ID, ID, and then ID nullable. Okay, over here, we got to change this just a little bit. App user ID, ID, ID nullable. And then the refresh token here is app user ID, ID, and then ID nullable. Like that. So in my startup now, my data access layer is going to be for a GUID nullable, and then a string. And this needs to be a GUID, and then a string. We need to fix all of this, but now this should be fine. IJWT service is a GUID and a string. GUID question mark, string, and a application user. My iUser service is a string and then the application user. And then we can get rid of the second context. Like that. And then we need to add this get. Which is just a virtual asynchronous task, and we want to return await user manager dot find by ID async of my ID. Okay, I'm gonna go on for 2 hours. I gotta take a break. I'll be back in 20 minutes. If you have any questions, great time to pop them into the chat. Also at our Discord, discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com, and I put all these videos up at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. Thanks again. I'll see you guys in just 20 minutes.